All right, welcome to my top 20 NFL fantasy wide receivers list as we head into the beginning of the season as drafts are picking up for fantasy football. So without further ado, let's get it started off with my number one pick for wide receivers. At number one, I have CeeDee Lamb with the Dallas Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb going at an average draft position at 2, just behind Christian McCaffrey. But in most draft boards, first wide receiver off the board. If it's not Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb might even be going over Christian McCaffrey. If there's anybody that's going to go over Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb is one of them. But yeah, with that, pretty high amount of points last year. Did really good. My main question with drafting CeeDee Lamb right now is the holdout situation. Lamb has been holding out so far this offseason, demanding a contract extension from the Cowboys. He's set to play on his fifth year option of his rookie deal if nothing ends up changing, but as many players might, he does also have the option of holding out as long as he wants to. Now, to be fair, especially once he gets into the regular season, if he starts holding out and actually missing games, the fines are going to start getting heavier, so he might choose to return even if they don't give him the extension. But we'll just have to see how hard he is wanting to fight the Cowboys on demanding this extension. It's likely based off of looking at what other receivers have gotten recently, especially top receivers this offseason. It's likely that CeeDee Lamb is hoping to get somewhere above $30 million a year, but Jerry Jones, owner of the Cowboys, has said that he's not really feeling any urgency to get CeeDee Lamb back. I don't know. Jerry Jones steps on his toes from time to time, I think. Not sure exactly if he said what he meant, but so far, obviously, he hasn't re-signed him yet, so maybe he's telling the truth, but if that's the truth, certainly not the way to build a roster to win a championship, and certainly also not a way to help fantasy owners who are wanting to win their championship. So, yeah, if you're going to draft CeeDee Lamb, good pick. Of course, the only concern is he going to be available for week 1 and for the early weeks of the season? But otherwise, assuming he and the Cowboys can get things figured out, or he just chooses to play on the fifth-year option, he should be back relatively quickly, if not in week 1. And when he is back, he should be a top performer pretty well week to week. At number 2 for the wide receiver list, I have Tyreek Hill. This should come as no surprise to you. Tyreek Hill scored 376 points last year, has a pretty good projection for this year. Hill is still one of, if not the best receivers in the league right now, as was seen this offseason. Not that really anybody agrees, but the NFL Top 100 list that's voted on by the players. Obviously, the players voted Tyreek Hill number 1, which, of course, players tend to vote often based off of pure talent, athleticism, things like that. Tyreek Hill certainly has that. He's been a very valuable player to any team he's been on, certainly on the Dolphins where he's at currently. So, certainly at least for fantasy and for drafting him, he's definitely one of the best. Again, he's generally going to be going behind CeeDee Lamb, but as you can see, his average draft position overall is 3, so only 1 behind CeeDee Lamb and 2 behind Christian McCaffrey, and really that top 3 is kind of one of those situations where I almost feel like, first of all, you got to be lucky enough to be drafting that early in the draft, and then second off, if you're picking in any of those 3 slots, really, it's kind of up to you what you want to pick. Also, which one of them falls to you, but especially if you're in like that number 1 or number 2 spot, if you're really not feeling CeeDee Lamb or Christian McCaffrey for something, maybe Christian McCaffrey, maybe you're worried he'll get injured this year or something. Maybe with CeeDee Lamb, you're worried about the holdout situation. Maybe you pick Tyreek Hill, even though his average draft position is, a couple spots later. If you're picking in number 1 or 2, if you want Tyreek Hill, just go for him because he's going to be gone by the time you next come around. So really, for Tyreek Hill, I don't have much as far as concerns go. He's got a good quarterback in Tua. Tua may not be the best quarterback in the league, but the Dolphins certainly showed this past year and in recent years that they can be a very explosive offense, very productive, especially towards the beginning of the year. And really for Tyreek Hill, he's a type of player that no matter how his team is doing, as long as he is healthy and on the field, he's going to be getting a lot of targets. He's going to be getting tons of attention, so he'll be a good pickup for you for fantasy. At number 3, I have Amon-Ra St. Brown with the Detroit Lions. If you watch the Netflix series for receivers this summer, you might be a little bit more familiar with Amon-Ra at this point. Star wide receiver for the Lions last year. I don't expect that to change this year. He should continue to be their number 1 receiver, get a lot of targets, tons of production. He's a great receiver. In the 2023 season, he did finish 3rd among wide receivers in fantasy points, and I think it's very reasonable to expect that he should be in the top 5 at least again this upcoming season. At number 4, for wide receivers in the fantasy drafts, I have Jamar Chase with the Cincinnati Bengals. Chase only finished 11th among wide receivers in 2023. A lot of that likely came because of the Bengals losing Joe Burrow pretty early not really early, but midway through the season. A good chunk of the season he was out. So, of course, that certainly put a dent into their playoff contention and just their overall production on offense. Their offense really took a hit losing Joe Burrow, and really most of last season he wasn't 100%. Even when he was playing, he was dealing with some injury stuff. I think it was with a calf, if I remember right. And so really most of the season, even when he was in, Joe Burrow just wasn't looking 100%. So honestly, a lot of those things contributed, I think, to Jamar Chase and the rest of the Bengals not performing as you would have hoped them to. So that's part of why I feel like he only ended up at 11th. But even with that, still 11th. That's still pretty good. That's still at least wide receiver 2 position worthy, if not, fringe wide receiver 1 for you last year. And this year, I certainly expect him to do better. He should be in that top 10 of receivers. At number 5, I have Justin Jefferson. Jefferson, I would expect him to have somewhat of a bounce back year from 2023, where he missed a lot of time due to injury. He's another one that you would have seen if you've watched the Netflix series on receivers. He was featured in it, and certainly one of the things you saw in the 2023 campaign is he did miss a good amount of time due to injury. He also had to deal with the fact of Kirk Cousins going down towards the latter half of the season. However, with that, it's not like he's getting Kirk Cousins back this season, so that is one thing you could be maybe slightly concerned about, is that unfortunately for Jefferson and Vikings fans, their quarterback room isn't looking all that great coming into this season. They've already lost their rookie quarterback that they drafted, J.J. McCarthy. Not that he was expected to be one of those quarterbacks to come in and be super ready this year, but they've already lost him to injury for the season, so whether he would have come in and lit the world on fire or not, it's still certainly a bummer for Vikings fans. And so for Jefferson, it's still, even if he wouldn't have been great, certainly shrinks the quarterback room for the Vikings that can be actually throwing to Jefferson. So, certainly not the best quarterback room, especially compared to what they had with Kirk Cousins. They're going to be starting with Sam Darnold. We'll see how well he can do, if he can stay healthy throughout the season. It's, even with all these changes to rules and stuff, quarterbacks are going down more than ever. I think each of the last 2 seasons we've had about 60-plus quarterbacks start a game in the regular season, so that's a pretty good amount of backup quarterbacks that have had to come in. But with Jefferson, again, regardless of the quarterback room, though, as long as Jefferson is healthy, I would expect him to still have a bounce-back year from 2023. No matter who's passing him the ball, if he's able to stay healthy himself, he should have tons of production, should be, of course, one of the best wide receivers, certainly one of the most entertaining, and as you can see, average draft position of 6, so middle of the first round, maybe even late of the first round, depending on, what people are doing in your league. Maybe some people are pessimistic enough about the Vikings quarterback room that maybe Jefferson can slide down and you can catch him at the end of the first round. At number 6, I have Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver A.J. Brown. Brown finished 5th last season among wide receivers, so that's pretty good. And on ESPN, his projected points would have him ending in 6th this upcoming season, so that's definitely really good. As you can see, obviously, even just in average draft position for wide receivers, he's going at 6th, so that matches with that projection. And I think he should have a pretty comparable year to what he did last year, which is certainly wide receiver 1 quality. At number 7, I have Puka Nacua. Now, of course, Puka Nacua stormed onto the scene last season. You should know who he is by this point. At the beginning of week 1 last season, according to ESPN, Puka Nacua was only rostered on about 1.8% of leagues in fantasy, which is insane. I mean, it makes sense. He was a rookie quarterback. I believe rookie wide receiver for Puka Nacua out of BYU, playing for the Rams. Also, wasn't like we had super high expectations for the Rams going into last year, and they certainly outperformed that, partially thanks to Puka Nacua, but I believe he was like a 3rd-round pick or something like that. He was a middle-round pick, so it wasn't like anybody was, even just in real life in football, it's not like anybody was expecting him to be crazy, but he pretty quickly stormed onto the scene, pretty quickly started popping off the screen, and pretty immediately became one of the most popular waiver wire pickups of the 2023 season, and after that, I don't think he was available on any leagues at that point. So certainly expect him to do really well this upcoming year. As you can see, he did really well in 2023, finished 4th among wide receivers. We'll have to see what happens this year with Cooper Kupp. Hasn't had the best last couple seasons. Seems to be aging a little bit, which is understandable for the age that that he is at right now. But although he's not really the oldest for a wide receiver, just unfortunately seems to be aging a little bit. Sometimes in the last couple of years, it's also just been dealing with injury. But yeah, so depending on how Cooper Kupp does, that could affect Puka Nakua's production a little bit. But another thing with him last season was he was also pretty consistent with his production. So I still think even if Cooper Kupp does come in and is more productive this year than he was last year, I still think Nakua can be productive as well. And at number 8, I have Garrett Wilson with the Jets. Now, of course, with Wilson, you'd certainly hope that Aaron Rodgers is going to be able to come in for the Jets, play healthy, play at least somewhat like his old self. We haven't seen him play a full game even in basically 2 years now. So, I mean, we'll have to see how that goes. I hope for Jets fans and for Rodgers and everyone involved, I hope things work out. And again, even if Rodgers comes in, stays healthy, and is just able to be kind of average, Garrett Wilson's a really good receiver. And as you can see, he's getting drafted about 13 overall, 7th among wide receivers. So that's early of the second round. You may be able to, certainly anybody is going to have at least one shot at drafting him if you want. But of course, if you're drafting like late in the first round, well, especially if you're in a snake draft, if you're drafting late in the first round, Garrett Wilson might actually be a perfect one for you. You could maybe draft a wide receiver draft a running back late in the first round and then come right around to 13. So that would be if you drafted 7th overall, you'd come back and you'd be on 13. You could draft Garrett Wilson and you'd have 2 really good, one running back, one wide receiver. You'd have your number 1 of each of those already set, pretty good to go. And yeah, I think there's potential there with Garrett Wilson. Didn't have the craziest year with the Jets last year, but that's the thing is one of the stats that's pretty cool for Garrett Wilson is that in his whole career with the New York Jets, the quarterbacks he's been getting thrown to haven't even ever exceeded a passer rating of 75. So that's pretty bad. So as I said, if Rodgers can come in and stay healthy and just be average and certainly like below what we would expect for Aaron Rodgers, if he can just be that's certainly better than a 75 rating for a quarterback. So that should certainly give Wilson more chances to produce. And even with that bad quarterback play, he has already in the past 2 seasons set a Jets franchise record for the most receiving yards and receptions in his first 2 seasons with the franchise. So obviously he's one of the best receivers they've ever had in franchise history, and that's coming with bad quarterback play. So if they can even just get average quarterback play, or average Aaron Rodgers, whatever that means, who was a first ballot Hall of Famer, he should be able to be a pretty good performer for you. And again, if you're able to get him in the early second round, and say Aaron Rodgers does come in and plays really well, and the Jets play really well, they make the playoffs this year, chances are Garrett Wilson will have had the chance to even be one of the better wide receiver ones. So I would say Garrett Wilson has some pretty good upside if you're optimistic on the Jets' chances this year. Now at number 9, I have Davante Adams. Davante, similar to Garrett Wilson in a sense, this past year didn't have the greatest fantasy stats or stats in general that he's ever had. The Raiders have had some struggles. Unfortunately for the Raiders, unlike the Jets where they have at least some glimmer of hope going into this season, the Raiders are certainly one of those teams that have, their win total bet for this season is pretty low. They're certainly believed to be one of the worst teams in the league. I mean, outside of Davante Adams, they really don't have a very good roster. They've got Max Crosby on the other side of the ball. They've got some other stars here and there, but otherwise it's certainly one of the weakest rosters. A new coach who, of course, came off of being interim head coach for them the last half of 2023. So we'll have to see how things go for Davante Adams. He's still one of the best wide receivers in the league. I certainly expect him to still perform well. It's just when you're starting out the season with Gardner Minshew as your starting quarterback, and that's the best you've got to offer at quarterback, I don't know. That's kind of a tough deal. But again, even with a bad quarterback, you can still have a wide receiver or a running back, something like that. You can still have these weapons that can be really good in fantasy. Just, of course, maybe not as good as they would be with a good quarterback. So, and going at 19 overall in fantasy drafts, that's pretty good. That's the end of the second round. So, end of the second round for Davante Adams, that's not a bad deal in my opinion. Now, moving on to the number 10 slot, I have Chris Olave with the Saints. The Saints, yet again, another wide receiver that isn't really on a roster that I love. Chris Olave is still one of the better receivers in the league. Right here, we're kind of reaching the end of wide receiver 1 territory, getting into that wide receiver 2 territory, going 23rd overall. That's not a bad spot that you could take him at. And to be fair, I've got Chris Olave here at 11. I've got Chris Olave at 10. Some people might have him even higher over people like Nakua or Garrett Wilson, such like that, or maybe even Devontae Adams. Maybe you pick Olave over Devontae Adams, but I don't know. Personally, for me, this is where Chris Olave falls into my top 20. At 11, I have Mike Evans. He's coming in with an average draft position at 32, 15th for wide receivers. Evans is entering into his 11th season, all those coming with Tampa Bay. He did just sign a contract extension in the offseason, so obviously he's not necessarily planning on hanging up the cleats anytime soon. As far as I remember, I think this past offseason he had said something to the effect that he truly plans on playing for at least another couple years. He feels like he's got plenty more in the tank. Since 2016, he's never finished a campaign worse than 23rd for wide receivers, so that's pretty good. I mean, of course, 23rd's not great, but that's still, 23rd. That's a really good flex player or a wide receiver 2 player. He's never finished below that, so he's always been starter worthy for fantasy ever since 2016. So that's a pretty good run as a fantasy wide receiver. And again, that goes back even further than the Tom Brady days. So he certainly knows how to do well, even with subpar quarterback play and subpar rosters. But of course, having Baker Mayfield had a career year last year, really. So as long as Evans and Baker Mayfield continue to bond and get better together, and the Bucs stay at least somewhat competitive, Evans should have plenty of a chance to be a really good producer for you on fantasy. At number 12, I have our first rookie, Marvin Harrison Jr., with the Arizona Cardinals. Again, I've got him here at 12th. He's actually getting drafted about 9th for wide receivers, 17th overall, but for me, that's maybe a little high. I don't know. I get the excitement of drafting a rookie, especially if that rookie is on your team, like your favorite NFL team. If that rookie is from that, certainly, I don't blame you for wanting to go and pick him. And Marvin Harrison Jr., to be fair, is probably one of the most NFL ready looking players we've seen come into the league. It's certainly this year and in recent years, he certainly looks ready to perform well. Should come in there and quite possibly end up as the wide receiver 1 for Arizona. And Kyler Murray may not be the most consistent quarterback or the best quarterback in the league, but he's still good, still has the ability to move around a little bit and, deliver the ball that way to wide receivers. So Harrison has a chance to be a really good rookie wide receiver, which could be really exciting for you. At number 13, I have Deebo Samuel, another wide receiver that was featured on the Netflix series this summer. He's getting drafted about 30 overall, and I've got him listed at 13 on my list, which is actually matches right up with where he's getting drafted for wide receivers at 13. And so I think he's well worth it here. Again, coming in at 30th overall. I mean, that's going to be the very beginning of the third round for you. So certainly everybody's going to have at least a couple chances to take Deebo Samuel if they want to. And I think he should be worth it. Now at number 14, we're going straight back to the 49ers, back with Brandon Ayuk. Now, Brandon Ayuk is another one that, like CeeDee Lamb, one of the bigger concerns would have to be with the hold in. Now with CeeDee Lamb, of course, he's doing the hold out. Brandon Ayuk, on the other hand, has been doing a hold in, which is similar, but the main difference being that Ayuk has been present for meetings and things like that during the preseason, just not actually practicing, not playing in preseason games, that kind of a thing. And, of course, that's been causing drama. There's been all this stuff this last few weeks trying to see if he's going to get traded to somewhere like the Steelers. I don't know about that. I think being that he hasn't already been moved, I think it's very possible, and especially being that the Niners have made it clear that they would prefer not to trade him, I think he'll be on the 49ers roster this season. It's just like with Lamb, the question is, will he end up playing the full season? Will he end up actually playing in week 1? Will he choose to not play because of the contract dispute and that kind of stuff? We'll have to see. So that's one concern. I mean, honestly, if that concern wasn't there, I might even bump up Brandon Ayuk at least a couple spots, even just comparing him to his own teammate, Deebo Samuel. I've got them right here back-to-back at 13 and 14. Maybe I would at least have Brandon Ayuk ahead of Deebo Samuel, being that both last season and their projections for this season, Brandon Ayuk actually does have more points. For me, I'm a little bit nervous about the holdout situation. Don't know if maybe there's a chance that Ayuk still gets traded before the beginning of the season, or even maybe he stays on the Niners, but they trade him before the deadline, maybe. And with all that kind of uncertainty, those are just small things that for me, maybe I shouldn't care as much about that. And again, I'm not saying that I dropped him a ton. Again, if I didn't have those concerns, I might have bumped him up 1 or 2 spots, but I still think being where he's at, and he's getting drafted at 36 overall. So that's the thing. comparing him to Deebo Samuel, he is getting drafted later on average, just barely by a few picks. So certainly, like if you get to the third round and you've got both Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk available, and you're trying to decide between the two, take your pick. They're both playing for San Francisco, at least currently. Both really good. Both obviously on a team that has plenty of weapons, still has potential to be very potent this season. So, in my opinion, if you're drafting middle of the third round or whatever, and those two are up available, pick whichever one you feel the most comfortable with. At number 15, I have Drake London. Now, Drake London is entering his third season. He's never been in the top 40 for fantasy wide receivers, so that's one thing that concerns me. But to be fair, in the last 2 seasons, he's had not great quarterback play. He's in the same boat there as Garrett Wilson, and yet Garrett Wilson has still been able to perform really well. But, you might be able to argue that even though the Jets have had bad quarterback rooms the last 2 years, they've at least had a good defense and had somewhat of a decent roster in certain areas. Maybe even, better than the Falcons have the last couple of years. That very well may be a fair analysis there. And so that may be part of it. Having Kirk Cousins there now and a new coaching staff and all that could very well help Drake London. So I think that's why he's on average getting drafted as high as he is. I've got him a little lower than his averages, but I still think this year could be the best year he's had so far, certainly. Now at number 16, I have Michael Pittman Jr. for the Colts. He finished 13th in 2023 among wide receivers. He was very consistent in fantasy. That's something I very much value in fantasy. I mentioned it in the previous video. Doesn't matter what level of player it is. Some of those players are going to be really consistent week to week, and you're going to be able to very easily rely on like their projected point totals for that week. You're going to be able to be confident that those totals are right, or at the very least, you'll be able to look to the past weeks and go, okay, this is what he's been getting. He'll probably get around this range this upcoming week. Whereas there's some players where it's almost like every other week they do good, and then they do bad, and then they do good, and then they do bad. And so some of those players that are more inconsistent, they can be frustrating because you just never know if, should I play them this week and then bench them the next? Or, some players, if they're really inconsistent, can be frustrating. But so for Michael Pittman Jr. in 2023, very often he scored right in between about 15 to 20 points a week, which is really good. His floor is about a stable wide receiver 2, and his potential this season feels like a wide receiver 1. So certainly middle of the third round or even fourth round where you might be able to get him if he drops. Certainly Michael Pittman Jr. could be a really good pickup for you. Now at number 17, I have Nico Collins with the Houston Texans. He's an ascending wide receiver. He had his best season thus far in 2023. He's very much still in his prime right now, or going into his prime, so he should have a very good year. One concern you could have for Nico Collins is the fact that the Texans did pick up Stephon Diggs from the Bills, so obviously Stephon Diggs, a really good wide receiver. To be fair, Stephon Diggs is a bit older, and Collins has the advantage of more chemistry and experience with C.J. Stroud. So Collins should be poised to still be the wide receiver 1 for the Texans throughout the season, but that's something that we'll certainly have to see as we go along. I think that's a good portion of why his projected point totals are so much lower than what he ended up with in 2023, but I still think even if Stephon Diggs comes in and steals a little bit of the targets that Collins has both wide receivers should be pretty good, and certainly Nico Collins should be a pretty good wide receiver 2, maybe wide receiver 1 potential for you. Now at number 18, I have Jalen Waddle. Waddle finished last season with 198.6 points. Waddle has been superb since he was selected in the 6th round of 2021, and since Tyreek Hill came to Miami 2 seasons ago, Waddle has averaged 7 targets and about 15 fantasy points a game, which is pretty good. I mean, that's certainly a pretty good wide receiver 2 worthy player there for you. And certainly with Mike McDaniel, as I mentioned earlier, it's hard to doubt the Dolphins' offense, at least earlier on in the season. When it gets to later in the season and playoffs and colder weather, that's another story. But of course, by then, fantasy playoffs are over. So, not really. That's the nice thing with the Dolphins. You don't have to worry too much about the concerns about cold weather and things for them, being that most of the time when you're going to need them in fantasy, they'll still be able to be playing in warmer weather for the most part. And Jalen Waddle, still really good. Again, they've got a lot of weapons, but I think he's a really good player. He comes in as kind of a fringe wide receiver 2 or a good flex player. Then at number 19, I have DK Metcalf with the Seahawks. Of course, there's the uncertainty in the fact that for the first time in a long time, the Seahawks have a new coach and a new coaching staff, so there's a lot of unknown there. But at least Metcalf does still have the same starting quarterback with Geno Smith. Now, to be fair, another thing there is it's not like they really got started off the best last season. That's why DK was only able to get 225.4 last season. And he also did miss a few games, so that's another thing too. He missed a few games last season, and with the, maybe not always being on the same page with Geno Smith, he still did really well, and certainly could be a pretty good, certainly a flex position player, maybe even a wide receiver too, depending on how things go for the Seahawks this year. Then finishing off the top 20 for wide receivers, I have DJ Moore. Now, DJ Moore, on average for wide receivers, is actually going 23rd for wide receivers, and as you can see, overall, 46th. Personally, this might be one that may have a little bit of bias for me, of course, being that he is on the Bears. He's their number one wide receiver. They extended him this season, so maybe I'm a little bit bullish on him, more so than others would be. But for me, really, once you get past like the top 8 wide receivers, then you get into the zone between like the top 9 to 16 or 17. They're all kind of in a bubble. And then after that, it kind of becomes a whole nother bubble for me. So, DJ Moore, I could even see people having him a little bit higher on this list, a bit lower on this list. A lot of these wide receivers, you could kind of change these in your draft order on your board, depending on your personal preferences and things like that. But for me, I think DJ Moore has plenty of potential to do well. Last season, his best week was against the Commanders, where he scored 49 fantasy points, so he certainly has very high scoring potential. The Bears' offense didn't have quite as much weapons as they do coming into 2024. They've added Keenan Allen, they drafted Rome Odunze, they added DeAndre Swift into the backfield, but of course, they drafted Caleb Williams, number 1 overall, so there's plenty of weapons to go around on offense, and that's not even mentioning Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett at tight end for the Bears. So certainly that might be one of the bigger concerns for DJ Moore. But of course, again, my thing is he had some very high scoring weeks last year, and even when he wasn't scoring 49 points, he was still, even in those more normal weeks, he was still scoring pretty well. He had a handful of weeks that were disappointing numbers, but again, I don't think this season is one that the Bears are going to be that disappointing on offense week to week. And again, if his numbers are low this year on any given week, it may just be because another receiver or weapon got more attention than him in that week. But still, DJ Moore, for the most part, should be the wide receiver 1. So he should be getting the lead of the targets, again, outside of maybe Keenan Allen. But Keenan Allen is getting farther into his career. Towards the end of it, DJ Moore is still in his prime. So that's one thing that should be an advantage for him. Now, just quickly to go over 3 honorable mentions I had. First being Stephon Diggs. Already talked about it. He's now going to be with the Texans. I think the Texans should be a good offense yet again this year with C.J. Stroud and now Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs in the wide receiver room. So Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs should have good potential to be starting worthy fantasy wide receivers. Another honorable mention being Cooper Kupp. We'll have to see. He's not had the best last couple seasons. People are worried that it's because he's aging. Maybe, maybe not. We'll have to see. But, I mean, his projected point totals aren't terrible. And if he's able to just do well, even just as a good wide receiver 2 behind Puka Nacua, with Matthew Stafford at quarterback, he should be able to do pretty well. And especially when they have Sean McVay, who is a genius young NFL head coach still at this point, he should have potential to quite possibly outperform this projection. And then finally, for honorable mentions, I have another rookie wide receiver here, Malik Neighbors with the Giants. Of course, the quarterback situation there being with Daniel Jones still not going to instill a lot of confidence in you there. And the Giants, another team that's not got the best roster, but Malik Neighbors still a top draft pick in this year's draft. Tons of potential. Seems like a very exciting player. He should certainly be one of, if not the most exciting player to watch for the Giants this season, so he should see plenty of action. He has potential to do really well. So that'll round out my honorable mentions for this video. There are a few other receivers that could have been on here. As I said, after you get past like the mid-teens, there's really like a good 10 wide receivers or so that could all have, reasons that you could be worried about some downside or believe that they have upside beyond their projections. So it really just depends on what you want, how much you want to read into certain things and what biases you want to play into it. So for me, that's going to be that top 20 list with 3 honorable mentions for you. this has been the top 20 NFL fantasy wide receivers list for 2024. Thank you for watching. Up next, I will have the top 20 fantasy quarterbacks coming very soon in the next couple of days, so look out for that. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, ding dong that notification bell. Also, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section down below. Who did I get wrong? Was there anybody that I left off this list that should have been on there? Anybody that I put way too high or somebody that I had way too low? Let me know all that down below, and I will see you in the next one.